The fork hit the table so hard it bounced twice before clattering to the floor, and every head in the Fairchild dining room snapped up at once. Theresa Cooper had not meant to drop it. She had not meant to do a great many things since arriving at the Fairchild Ranch 3 weeks ago, but watching two boys eat their supper in absolute, suffocating silence while their father stared at his plate like it contained the answers to questions he was too exhausted to ask had finally broken something open inside her chest. "That is enough," she said, and her voice came out louder than she intended, sharp enough to cut through the heavy evening air that had settled over the table like a funeral shroud. Both boys froze. Eli, who was 9, had a spoonful of beans halfway to his mouth. Samuel, who had just turned 7 in the spring, gripped the edge of the table with both small hands as though he expected the earth to tilt. Noah Fairchild lifted his eyes from his plate slowly, the way a man lifts his head when he has learned that whatever is coming is going to cost him something. "Enough of what, Miss Cooper?" he said. His voice was low and measured and entirely controlled, and that control, that careful, deliberate restraint he wore like armor, was exactly what had been driving Theresa slowly out of her mind. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed her chair back, walked around the table and sat down directly between his two sons on the long bench seat. Eli stared at her. Samuel stared at her. Noah watched her with those dark, guarded eyes that gave nothing away and cost everything to look into. "Tell me," Theresa said, placing her hands flat on the table and looking first at Eli, then at Samuel, "what makes you laugh?" The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. It was not the silence of grief, which was what had lived in this house for a full year since Margaret Fairchild had died of fever in the spring of 1882. It was not the silence of habit or the silence of men who had forgotten how to speak to each other. It was the silence of something cracking open, something that had been sealed shut and was now, very slowly, beginning to breathe. Eli looked at his father. Noah said nothing. Samuel looked at Theresa, and something in his 7-year-old face flickered, uncertain and desperately hopeful at the same time, and he said, "Eli sat on a horned toad last summer and screamed like a lady." And Eli said, "I did not scream like a lady." And Samuel said, "You screamed exactly like a lady." And Eli turned red as a beet and said, "It bit me." And Samuel dissolved into laughter, real laughter, the kind that takes over a small body completely, and Eli started laughing too despite himself, and Theresa was laughing, and the sound of it filled the room like something the room had been starving for. Noah Fairchild sat very still at the head of his table and watched and said nothing. But his hands, which had been gripping his fork so tightly his knuckles were pale, slowly relaxed. And something moved across his face in the lamplight that Theresa would spend weeks trying to name, before she finally understood what it was. It was the first crack in the wall he had built around everything he had left to lose. Theresa Cooper had not come to Sweetwater Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1883 looking for a man to love. That was the most important thing to understand about how all of this began, because if you understood that, you understood everything else. She had come looking for work. She had come because her options in Abilene, Kansas had narrowed to a point sharp enough to draw blood, and because the advertisement in the Abilene Daily Chronicle had described a position as housekeeper and children's tutor on a working cattle ranch in the New Mexico Territory, and because she was 26 years old, capable, educated to a level unusual for a woman of her circumstances, and out of money. The advertisement had been written by a ranch hand named Hector Vargas at Noah's direction, and it had been deliberately sparse on details. It had mentioned 2 children. It had mentioned fair wages and room and board. It had not mentioned that the children had not laughed in a year. It had not mentioned that their mother had died. It had not mentioned that Noah Fairchild had interviewed 7 women before Theresa, dismissed all 7 within a week, and was operating under the firm conviction that the right woman for the job was one who would maintain appropriate professional distance from his family, educate his sons in letters and arithmetic, keep a clean house, and otherwise leave the emotional landscape of the Fairchild Ranch exactly as he had arranged it. Theresa had arrived on the stage from Santa Fe on a Thursday in early April. She had been wearing a dark green wool traveling dress that was 2 seasons out of fashion and had a small repair on the left cuff that she had been careful to conceal. And she had been carrying a single leather trunk and a carpet bag that contained, among other things, 3 books, a portable writing desk, a photograph of her mother, and a complete set of the McGuffey Eclectic Readers for grades 1 through 4, which she had bought used in Abilene and considered her most important professional investment. The stage had deposited her in front of the general store in Sweetwater Creek at 2 in the afternoon. The town was not large. It had a main street of hard-packed red dirt, a hotel, a saloon called the Red Horse that operated out of a building that had once been a livery, a blacksmith, a dry goods store, the general store, a small schoolhouse that was open 3 days a week when the schoolteacher was sober, a church, and a post office that occupied the front corner of the general store. The surrounding territory was high desert, scrub oak and pinon pine, and red rock formations that rose out of the earth like something from the Old Testament, and the sky above it was the kind of blue that makes people from the east feel simultaneously small and tremendously alive. Noah Fairchild had been waiting at the stage stop. She had known him immediately, not because he was particularly remarkable to look at in that first moment, though she would come to understand later that he was, but because he had the posture of a man waiting for something he had already decided was going to disappoint him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was clean-shaved but shadowed, and he was wearing work clothes rather than anything he might have considered dressing for, which told her he had come straight from the range. He was 34 years old. He looked 40. Grief does that to a person. "Miss Cooper," he said. "Mr. Fairchild," she said. He looked at her trunk and her carpet bag and then at her directly, and his assessment was thorough and entirely without pretense. She returned it with equal directness, because she had learned a long time ago that women who apologized for looking a man in the eye tended to spend their lives apologizing for other things too. "I'll take your trunk," he said. "Thank you," she said. He loaded it into the back of a buckboard wagon with a matter-of-fact efficiency that suggested he had strong opinions about wasted motion, helped her up to the seat with a hand that was calloused and warm, and then they drove the 4 miles out to the Fairchild Ranch in almost complete silence, which she found interesting rather than uncomfortable, and which told her a great deal about him that he had not intended to tell. The ranch was not what she had expected. She had expected something rougher, more provisional, the way frontier homesteads tended to look when they were still in the process of becoming something. The Fairchild Ranch was already something. The main house was 2 stories, built from adobe brick and good lumber, with a wide porch running along the front and a kitchen garden along the south side that had clearly been planted with care and was now running slightly to ruin from inattention. There was a substantial barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, a well, a chicken coop, and several acres of fenced pasture. It was a working ranch, productive and serious, and it had the feel of a place that had once been loved and was now merely managed. She met Eli and Samuel that first evening at supper. They had been sitting at the table already when she came in from having been shown to her room, which was off the back of the kitchen and was clean and spare and adequate. They were seated side by side on the bench, and they regarded her with the careful, measuring look that children use when they are trying to determine whether an adult is safe. She had sat across from them and asked them their names, and they had told her in quiet voices, and she had told them hers, and then Noah had come in from washing up and sat at the head of the table, and they had all eaten together, and it had been the most profoundly silent meal she had ever experienced. Not uncomfortable silence exactly. There was nothing hostile in it. It was more like the silence of a house where the person who had known how to fill the silence was gone, and nobody remaining had figured out yet how to do it differently, And so they had all quietly agreed, without ever discussing it, to simply not try. She had tried that first week to ask them things. She had asked Eli about his lessons and received careful, minimal answers. She had asked Samuel if he had a favorite game, and he had looked at her as though the question were in a language he did not quite speak. She had asked Noah at the end of the first week whether the boys had always been this quiet, and he had said, with the careful precision of a man choosing every word like he was picking his way across a minefield, "They are fine. Mr. Fairchild," she had said, "with respect, they are not fine." He had looked at her with those dark, controlled eyes and said, "Your position here is as housekeeper and tutor, Miss Cooper. The children's emotional welfare is my concern." "Then perhaps you might consider being concerned about it," she had said. He had said nothing to that, which she had decided to count as a point in her favor. She did not push further that first week, because she was smarter than to push a wall before she understood its construction. Instead, she watched. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the way Noah's day began before first light and ended after dark, the way he managed the hands with a quiet authority that earned rather than demanded respect, the way he checked on his sons each evening at bedtime in a ritual that was tender and wordless and somehow heartbreaking to observe from a distance. He tucked them in. He did not read to them, because whoever had read to them was gone, and he did not know how to step into that particular vacancy. But he tucked them in every night, and he stood at the doorway for a moment after, and the look on his face in that doorway was the kind of look that lives in a person's chest like a splinter. She started reading to the boys at bedtime in the second week. She did not ask permission. She simply appeared with one of her books one evening and sat on the chair between their two beds and began reading from a collection of illustrated fables she had found on the shelf in the sitting room, clearly left from before. Eli had pulled his blanket up and pretended to look at the ceiling. Samuel had watched her with round, serious eyes. By the third page, Eli had stopped looking at the ceiling. By the fifth page, he had asked a question about the picture. She had answered it. They had had a conversation. It had lasted 4 minutes, but it had happened. Noah had been standing in the hallway. She had not realized it until she came out of the room and nearly walked into him. He had stepped back and she had looked up at him, and for a moment they were standing very close in the narrow, dark hallway with the lamplight from the boys' room making a warm stripe across the floor, and he had said, in a voice that was quieter and less controlled than his usual careful register, "You didn't ask." "No," she said, "I didn't." He studied her for a long moment. "All right," he said finally. It was not permission exactly. It was something more like a surrender, small and carefully contained, and she accepted it the way she accepted all the small things about Noah Fairchild, which was to say with absolute attention and without showing it on her face. The situation at the Fairchild Ranch was not difficult to understand once you had the outlines of it. Noah had met Margaret Dalton in 1870, when he was 21 and she was 18, and they were both newly arrived in the territory from different directions, he from Missouri, she from Tennessee. They had married in 1871 and built the ranch together from a land grant and sheer physical labor over the years that followed. They had been, by all accounts she had gathered from careful listening around the town, a well-matched pair. Not dramatically romantic, not the kind of love story that gets told in saloons, but something solid and mutual and sustaining. They had wanted children and had them, 2 sons, and they had made a life that worked. And then in April of 1882, a fever had come through Sweetwater Creek that took 3 people, and one of them was Margaret Fairchild, who had been 30 years old and apparently the person in the household who knew how to make it feel like a home rather than just a structure. She had been gone 14 months when Theresa arrived. Noah had managed. That was the honest description. He had managed the ranch and he had managed the children, and he had managed his grief with the same controlled efficiency with which he managed everything else. And the result was 2 small boys who had learned that the correct way to exist was quietly, carefully, without taking up too much space or making too much sound, because the house they lived in had contracted around its loss like a wound, and they were young enough and sensitive enough to have contracted with it. This was what Theresa had sat down between them at supper that evening 3 weeks in, and decided to refuse to accept. The night of the horned-toad story, after the boys had finally gone to bed still giggling about Eli's encounter with the wildlife, Theresa had washed the dishes in the kitchen and been preparing to retire to her room when Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding a cup of coffee that he had poured himself from the pot she kept warm on the stove, which he had started doing in the second week without comment, and he leaned against the doorframe with the relaxed alertness of a man who spent most of his life outdoors and carried it in his body. "You should know," he said, "that I heard them tonight from my study." She kept washing. "I know," she said. "I haven't heard Samuel laugh like that since he started again. In some time." She rinsed a plate and set it in the drying rack. "They're good boys," she said. "They've just been very careful." "Careful," he repeated as though the word were unexpected. "They've been watching you," she said, because she had decided to tell him the truth and see what it did. Children follow their parents' lead on how to be. You've been telling them without words that the correct way to manage loss is to go quiet and work hard and not let it touch you. And they've done exactly that. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It had something raw in it. "That's a frank assessment," he said. "You seem like a man who prefers frank," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret used to say I had all the emotional expression of a fence post." It was the first time he had said his wife's name to her directly, and she was careful not to react to it visibly, because she understood that it had cost him something and she did not want to make him regret it. "She wasn't entirely wrong," Theresa said, and there was a warmth in her voice that took the edge off it, and Noah made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was the closest thing she had heard from him yet. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and turned to face him, and he was watching her with an expression that was different from his usual careful assessment. There was something curious in it, something that was beginning to look, if she was reading it right, like genuine interest, and she was extremely careful not to let what that did to her own chest show on her face. "Good night, Mr. Fairchild," she said. "Good night, Miss Cooper," he said, and did not move from the doorway until she had passed through it. The next morning Theresa found a small posy of wild paintbrush on the kitchen table, the kind that grew along the north fence line of the property. There was no note. Noah was already out on the range when she came down. She put the flowers in a tin cup of water and set them in the kitchen window, and when he came in for the midday meal, she watched him see them there, and something moved in his face that he quickly controlled, and she thought, very clearly and with a steadiness that surprised her, that she was in serious trouble. She had not come here to fall in love with Noah Fairchild. She had come here because she needed employment and he had needed help, and those were clean, practical reasons that had nothing to do with the way he looked at his sons in the doorway at night, or the way he had said his dead wife's name in the kitchen with all that careful restraint failing him just slightly at the edges, or the way he moved through his own land with a quiet authority that was never harsh, never careless, always completely present. She was in trouble and she knew it, and she resolved to be sensible about it. She was not sensible about it. It began with the garden. She had been looking at the kitchen garden along the south side of the house since her arrival with the specific frustration of someone who knows how to do a thing and is being prevented from doing it by logistics rather than ability. She had the knowledge. She had looked at the seed packets in the dry goods store in town. She did not technically have authorization to undertake a garden project because her position was housekeeper and tutor, not groundskeeper. She started the garden on a Monday morning with Eli and Samuel helping her, which transformed it into an educational project about plants and soil and the water cycle, and therefore squarely within the scope of her employment. She made this argument to herself with considerable satisfaction. Noah came around the corner of the house at 10 in the morning and found her on her knees in the dirt with both of his sons beside her, All three of them engaged in a serious discussion about whether tomatoes or beans should go along the south wall. "Miss Cooper," he said. "Mr. Fairchild," she said without looking up. "Your boys are debating agricultural strategy. Samuel believes in beans. Eli is lobbying hard for tomatoes. I am remaining neutral." There was a pause. "It was my wife's garden," he said. She did look up then, and she held his eyes directly. "Yes," she said. "I know. I think she would want it used." The thing about Noah Fairchild was that he was not, beneath all that careful control, a cold man. He was a man who had loved deeply and lost badly and concluded, in the aftermath of that loss, that the safest approach was to seal everything up and manage it. But the seal had never been perfect, and Theresa had been finding the cracks in it from the first week, not because she was manipulating him, but because she was simply herself, direct and warm and entirely unwilling to pretend not to notice things that needed noticing. He looked at his sons in the dirt, serious and engaged, Samuel already trying to poke a hole for a seed with one small finger, Eli explaining to him that the hole needed to be deeper with the authority of someone who had just heard this fact 30 seconds ago. And he looked at Theresa, who was watching his sons with an expression of uncomplicated delight, and he said, "Tomatoes along the south wall, beans on the east. Margaret always did them that way." "Thank you," Theresa said. He nodded and went back to his work, and she turned back to the garden, and the day went on. She learned things about him in fragments, the way you learn things about people who do not voluntarily offer information. She learned them from Hector Vargas, who was the senior ranch hand and had been with Noah for 8 years, and had a deep, undemonstrative loyalty to the Fairchild family that expressed itself in the form of opinions delivered when he thought the timing was right. She learned them from the boys, who began, slowly and then faster, to talk to her during their lessons and at meals and in the garden. She learned them from the house itself, which had the character of a place where two people had made considered choices together. Noah Fairchild had come to the New Mexico territory at 20 years old with $30 and a mule, and a conviction that the land could be made into something. He had been right. He had also, Hector told her one afternoon while she was bringing water to the barn, and he was repairing a stall gate, been the kind of young man who smiled easily and laughed often, and had no idea how much of that had been constructed by the presence of a particular person in his life, until that person was gone. He used to whistle, Hector said, not looking up from the gate hinge he was working. All the time, drove some of the hands half mad. He has not whistled once since Mrs. Fairchild died. Theresa thought about that for a long time. The first time Noah Fairchild did something that revealed clearly that he was losing the battle against what he felt was on a Saturday in late May, 6 weeks after her arrival. She had been in town with the boys to pick up a parcel from the post office, and on the return she had stopped the wagon to let Samuel investigate a horned lizard that was sitting on a rock beside the road, because Samuel had become intensely interested in lizards since the incident of Eli and the horned toad, which remained a source of enormous comedy in the household. She had been explaining to Samuel why the lizard's flat body shape helped it regulate temperature when a rider came up the road at a speed that sent dust flying and spooked the horse. The horse had shied hard, and Theresa had dropped the reins for a fraction of a second before getting them back, and the wagon had lurched, and she had caught both boys with an arm before anyone fell, and the whole incident had been over in about 4 seconds with no harm done. When they arrived back at the ranch, Noah had been in the yard talking to one of the hands. He had taken one look at her face, which she had thought was quite composed, and said, "What happened?" It was not a question. She told him the abbreviated version. The rider, the horse, the lurch, everyone fine. He listened with his usual stillness, and then he looked at Samuel and Eli in a way that was brief and very thorough, confirming their intactness with his own eyes, and then he looked at Theresa and said, with a quietness that had something underneath it that was not quiet at all, "You caught them." "Of course I caught them," she said, mildly puzzled by the statement. He looked at her for a moment longer than was quite neutral, and then he nodded and said, "Good," and went back to his conversation with the hand. And Theresa went into the house and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the cool edge of the table and thought about the way he had said, "You caught them," with that thing underneath his voice, and understood that the word he had been unable to say, the word that lived under the surface of that exchange, was them. Not just his sons. Them. She was inside the perimeter of his concern now. He had not meant to let her in there, and he was not happy about it, and there was absolutely nothing he was going to do about it, and she knew it. She was not sensible about this at all. June in the New Mexico territory was hot and dry and tremendous, the sky a bowl of blazing blue over the red earth, the nights cool enough to require a blanket. Theresa had settled into the rhythms of the ranch with the ease of a person who was genuinely suited to this kind of life, which surprised her slightly because she had grown up in a town, in Abilene, in a household that had been reasonably middle class until her father's death when she was 15, had made it rapidly and thoroughly not middle class, and she had thought she was a person of towns rather than open land. She was not. She was a person of open land, it turned out, or at least she was a person of this open land, with these red rocks and this enormous sky, and these two boys who had started coming to find her in the mornings before lessons just to tell her things, because they were discovering that she would listen completely and respond with interest, and that this was apparently not something they had had unlimited access to for the past year. Eli found her one Tuesday morning while she was hanging laundry and told her with great seriousness that he thought he wanted to be a rancher like his father when he grew up, but that he also thought he might want to be a man who studied rocks because there were so many interesting rocks in the territory and somebody should study them. "You could do both," Theresa told him. "A man can study rocks and run a ranch. They are not mutually exclusive." Eli considered this. What does exclusive mean? It means things that cannot exist at the same time, a contradiction. So not exclusive means they can both be true. Exactly so. Eli processed this with the careful deliberateness that was his way, which reminded her of his father. "Father knows a lot about rocks," he said after a moment. "He showed me once where you can find garnets in the creek bed." "Did he?" she said. "He hasn't done it in a while," Eli said, in the particular tone that children use when they are reporting information they find significant but do not know quite how to address. She looked at him. "Would you like to ask him?" Eli shrugged in the way that meant yes, but it felt too large to say yes to. "Maybe," he said. "I don't know if he'd want to." "I think," Theresa said carefully, "that there are things your father very much wants that he hasn't figured out how to want again yet. I think he might need to be asked." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he took a clothespin from the basket and handed it to her with the efficient helpfulness that was entirely his own and said, "Miss Cooper, are you going to stay here?" The question hit her somewhere between her ribs. "I have a position here for as long as your father wants me," she said. "But do you want to stay?" he said, with the directness of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to dress questions in anything more polite than their actual meaning. She thought about how to answer that honestly and found, to her considerable internal discomfort, that the honest answer was much larger and more complicated than anything she could say to a 9-year-old. "Yes," she said, "I do." Eli nodded as though this confirmed something he had decided privately. "Good," he said, and went back to the house. That Saturday, Noah took both his sons to the creek to find garnets. She did not know who had initiated it. She found out from Samuel, who came back with 3 small red stones and a comprehensive account of the expedition that involved Noah wading into the creek up to his knees and finding the best specimen of the afternoon, and then pretending he hadn't been the one to find it so Eli could have the best one. Theresa received this account while sitting on the porch steps in the early evening light, and Samuel climbed up beside her and pressed one of his garnets into her hand and said, "Father said to give you this one." She held the small red stone and looked at it for a long time and thought about dark past secrets that run so deep in a person that they cannot be excavated by will alone. They can only be coaxed out by warmth and time, and the patient refusal to give up on the life that's still possible. And she thought about hidden motives and whether she had any, whether the real reason she had made herself so indispensable to this family was purely professional, or whether it was something else entirely, something that had been growing in her steadily since the night in the kitchen when he had said his wife's name, and something in his voice had broken open just slightly. She kept the garnet. Noah found her on the porch later that evening after the boys were in bed. He sat on the step below hers, which put their eyes on nearly the same level, and they sat together looking out at the dark ranch yard with the stars blazing overhead the way they only blazed in high desert country, and the warm night smelled of pinon smoke from the dying cook fire. "Eli told me you said I needed to be asked," he said. She was briefly startled. "He told you that?" "My son has a great deal of his mother in him," Noah said. "He does not believe in information sitting idle when it could be put to use." She absorbed this. "I hope I didn't overstep." "You overstepped from approximately day 2, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a complaint. "The garden, the bedtime reading, the supper conversation tonight. I can be more don't," he said. It came out quickly, and the quickness surprised them both, and he was quiet for a moment before continuing. "Don't be less. I am saying it badly. I mean that my sons have been," he stopped. "They have been more themselves in the past 6 weeks than they have been in the past year, and I am aware that I am responsible for the year, and that is not a comfortable thing to sit with." "You did not do it from cruelty," she said. "No," he agreed. Cruelty would have been easier to correct. She looked at his profile in the dark and felt the specific tenderness that comes from watching a genuinely good person struggle against themselves. "You loved her," she said. "You were devastated. You did the only thing you knew how to do, which was to be steady and keep going. You kept your family alive and your ranch running and your sons fed and housed. That is not nothing, Mr. Fairchild." He was quiet for a long time. "Noah," he said finally, "I'm sorry." "You could call me Noah. Given that you are running my household and raising my sons and redesigning my wife's garden, the formal address seems like it might be past its useful life." She felt something warm move through her chest that she was determined to manage carefully. "All right," she said. "Noah." He turned to look at her then, and in the starlight his face was less guarded than she had ever seen it, and she understood that this was what he looked like under all the careful management. This man with the quiet eyes and the rancher's hands who had once whistled all the time and had garnets in the creek, and had pressed one of them into his son's hand to give to her. "Theresa," he said, as though trying the name out, and it sounded different coming from him than it had ever sounded from anyone else, and she thought, clearly and with a steadiness that she recognized as false because her heart was doing something entirely unsteady, that she was very far past sensible. "Good night, Noah," she said. "Good night, Theresa," he said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for a while. When she lay in her room listening to the night sounds of the ranch, she could hear him out there, moving occasionally, and once, just once, so briefly she might have imagined it, the first few notes of something she thought might have been a whistle, stopped quickly, as though he had startled himself. She smiled at the dark ceiling and told herself to be sensible tomorrow. The complications arrived, as complications in the territory tended to do, without a great deal of warning and with a full set of consequences. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he arrived at the ranch on the first Wednesday in July with 2 men she did not recognize, and a manner that had the specific quality of a man who was accustomed to being powerful in ways that did not require being polite. He was perhaps 45, heavy through the middle in the way of a man who had once been physical and let it go to prosperity, and he had a smile that did not connect to his eyes. She knew the type. She had grown up watching her mother navigate men of this type, men who treated the world as a series of arrangements to be made and extracted from, and she had developed an acute sensitivity to the specific quality of the trap they set around themselves. She was in the yard when he arrived, beating a rug from the sitting room, and she watched Noah come out of the barn, and she watched the 2 men look at each other, and she understood before a word was spoken that whatever this was, it was old. "Fairchild," Marsh said from horseback. "Marsh," Noah said from the ground. The history in that exchange was dense. She stayed where she was, because she was not a woman who made herself conveniently absent when things became complicated. The conversation that followed, which she heard fragments of and had the rest filled in by Hector that evening, concerned water rights. The Fairchild Ranch had claim to a section of the creek that fed the east pasture, claim that had been legally established in 1875 and was as solid as land law in the territory got. Gerald Marsh had spent the past 2 years quietly acquiring land along the upper portion of the same creek, and he was now in a position where redirecting the creek's flow in his favor was technically possible if the Fairchild water rights could be challenged or circumvented. He had come with an offer to buy out the water rights, which Noah had declined. He had then suggested, with the pleasantness of a man who does not need to be unpleasant because his position is strong enough, that Noah might want to consider his situation carefully. He's been pressuring some of the smaller landowners east of here, Hector told her. 2 families sold their grazing rights to him in the spring. He's been building something for a long time. Can he challenge the water rights legally? She asked. Hector shrugged. He's got a lawyer in Santa Fe working on it. Noah's got the original grant, but the territorial law is not always clean, and Marsh has money enough to make unclear what should be clear. This was a crisis. Not an immediate, dramatic crisis of the kind that came with guns at dawn, but the slow, grinding kind of crisis that was often harder to fight because it was harder to identify as a fight, and because it had the quality of a trap, which was to say that the longer you waited, the narrower your options became. Noah did not tell her this directly, because Noah's tendency under pressure was to become even more contained and controlled, but she had been watching him closely enough by July to read his face like a text she had studied, and she could see it in the set of his jaw and the way he stayed in his study late into the evenings with papers spread across the desk. She knocked on the study door on a Thursday evening. "Come in," he said without looking up. She came in and set a cup of coffee on the desk next to his papers and looked at what was in front of him, which were maps and the original land grant documentation and what appeared to be correspondence, and she said, "Tell me what you need." He looked up. "It's not your concern. Everything on this ranch is my concern," she said calmly. "I am invested in it. You are employed by it. Noah." She said his name with the patience of a woman who is not going to let him retreat into the wall again and is absolutely prepared to make that clear. "Tell me what you need." He looked at her for a long moment, and then the thing he always did, the thing she had been slowly, steadily making less possible, the slamming shut of every internal door happened, but this time it was slower and less complete, and through the gap she could see something that was not stubbornness but was very close to desperation. "I need a lawyer I can trust," he said, "and someone who understands the territorial water law well enough to challenge Marsh's filing, and approximately 3 months I don't have. What is your attorney in Santa Fe saying? That I have a solid case, and it will cost me money I have tied up in this year's herd to pursue it aggressively." She pulled up the chair from the corner and sat down across from him and looked at the maps. "What has Marsh filed specifically?" He looked at her with what was, she realized, the specific look of a man who has discovered that a person he thought he understood is larger than he understood, and that this is both wonderful and alarming. "You know land law." "My father was a land agent," she said. "Until he died, he was a thorough one. I helped him from the time I was 12. I know more land law than most men find comfortable in a woman, which is one of the reasons I ended up as a housekeeper in New Mexico rather than anything else." The injustice in that sentence lived there plainly, and he heard it and she saw it register. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's what it is," she said. "Show me what he filed." They sat in the study until nearly midnight, going through the documentation with the careful thoroughness that the situation required. She knew land law well enough to identify 3 weaknesses in Marsh's filing within the first hour, weaknesses that his Santa Fe lawyer might have missed or chosen not to emphasize. She also identified the specific precedent in territorial water rights case law that would anchor Noah's counterargument most effectively, which she had encountered in a case her father had consulted on in 1871 and had read about extensively because it had been interesting. At midnight, Noah sat back in his chair and looked at her across the desk with an expression she had not seen before, something open and direct and entirely undefended, and said, "Where did you come from, Theresa Cooper?" It was not a question about geography. She felt the warmth of it move through her and said, steadily, "Abilene, Kansas." "I know that," he said. "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. They looked at each other across the desk in the lamplight, and the map of his land lay between them, and outside the night was full of summer cricket sound and stars, and she thought that if she were not very careful she was going to do something that would make her position on this ranch extremely complicated. She was not very careful. "Noah," she said. "Don't," he said, and then, after a moment, "Not yet, I'm not," he stopped, started again. "I need to be honest with you. I am not in a position where it would be fair to." He looked away and then back. "I have not been honest with myself about what has been happening here since you arrived, and I owe you the honesty of admitting that. But I am also a man with 2 sons and a legal fight and a ranch that I built with someone else, and I don't know yet what it looks like to—" "You don't have to know yet," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything." "You're not," he said. "That's part of the problem." She looked at him for a moment and then stood and picked up the notes she had made from the documents. "I'll write up the key points tonight," she said. "You can send them to your Santa Fe lawyer tomorrow. Tell him to look at the 1878 precedent. He'll know what to do with it. Theresa." "Good night, Noah," she said, and left him in the study with the lamp and the maps and whatever he was wrestling with, because she understood that some things needed to be wrestled with alone, and that the most useful thing she could do was let him do it. She was up early the next morning. He was in the kitchen when she came down, which was unusual. He typically left for the range before the household was awake. He was standing at the window with his coffee, and when she came in, he turned and looked at her with the look of a man who has made a decision. "I need to ask you something," he said. She began making the breakfast things because her hands needed to do something. "All right," she said. "I need to know whether you are here because you needed a position, which I understand and have no complaint with, or whether you are here because—" He stopped. "This is coming out wrong." "Try again," she said. "Are you staying because it is a job," he said carefully and precisely, "or are you staying because you want to be here?" She set down the coffee pot and turned to look at him fully. "I have been telling you in every way I know how that I want to be here," she said. "I would like, very much, for you to believe me." He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took both her hands in his, which was the first time he had touched her with any intention, any deliberateness, and his hands were warm and certain, and she felt the specific shock of it in her whole body. He looked at her for a moment that stretched into something significant. "I lost someone," he said. "I am not over it. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," she said. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "You're doing it right now," she said. He kissed her then, very carefully, in the kitchen in the early morning with the sun coming through the window, and it was brief and careful and entirely certain. The way everything he did was entirely certain once he had decided. And she thought that she had come to this ranch with $30 and a set of McGuffey readers, and the conviction that she was looking for work. And she had found instead, in the middle of the New Mexico Territory in the year 1883, the most complete feeling she had ever experienced in her life. He stepped back and looked at her and said, "The boys are going to say they already knew." "Samuel is going to be insufferably smug about it," she agreed. He smiled. It was a full smile, the first one she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, brought back the man Hector had described, the one who whistled and laughed easily, still there under the year of grief, waiting to be recovered. She looked at that smile and thought that whatever had brought her to this territory, she was not going anywhere. The Marsh situation resolved itself over the following 2 months with the precision of a legal counterargument well constructed. Noah's Santa Fe lawyer took the precedent she had identified and built a counterfiling that challenged Marsh's claim on 3 separate grounds, the most significant of which was a procedural error in the original filing that invalidated the strongest element of his argument. Marsh, it turned out, was not accustomed to a fight that cost him more than he expected, and when the legal costs began to mount and the precedent held, he shifted his attention elsewhere. It was not a dramatic resolution. There was no confrontation, no guns, no single moment of victory. It was the resolution of a grinding, slow crisis through persistence and preparation, and the right information at the right time. And when it was finally settled in September, with the Fairchild water rights confirmed and Marsh's filing rejected by the territorial recorder, Noah came home from Santa Fe with the paperwork and found Theresa in the kitchen garden with both boys, all 3 of them arguing productively about whether the tomatoes had been a success this year or merely adequate. And he stood at the corner of the house and watched them for a long moment before any of them noticed he was there. It was Eli who saw him first. He looked at his father's face and said, "Did you win?" "We won," Noah said. Samuel threw a moderately ripe tomato into the air and caught it and said, "Miss Cooper said you would win," with the satisfied conviction of someone whose trust in a person has been proved entirely correct. Noah looked at Theresa over both his sons' heads and she looked back at him, and the look between them was warm and private and full of the particular contentment of people who have found, after considerable effort, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. The autumn of 1883 settled over the Fairchild Ranch with the particular beauty of the New Mexico territory in fall, the scrub oak going gold, the air sharpening, the sky deepening to an evening blue that was almost purple at the horizon. The ranch went into its winter preparations with the efficiency of an operation that had been running well for years, and was now, additionally, the kind of place where supper was loud sometimes, where things got laughed at, where a woman sang occasionally in the kitchen in the mornings, where 2 boys had rediscovered that life was something to be lived in rather than merely survived. Noah had kissed her in the kitchen in July, and they had navigated the weeks that followed with the careful attention of 2 serious people who understood that what they were building had weight and consequence. He had talked to her about Margaret, more than once, in the evenings after the boys were asleep, in the way that a man must talk about a thing he has been holding alone for too long before he can set it down properly. She had listened and asked questions and said the things that were true, that grief was not a betrayal of the living, that loving again was not forgetting, that his sons needed a father who was whole more than they needed one who was perfectly faithful to a pain. He had listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave everything, thorough and complete, and she had understood that one of the things she loved most about him was that he was genuinely capable of changing his mind when given sufficient reason, which was rarer in men than it should have been, and she valued it enormously. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday evening in October, on the porch of the house, with the first true cold of the season in the air, and the stars blazing and both boys conspicuously inside, which she suspected had been arranged. He was sitting beside her on the porch steps, the way they had taken to sitting in the evenings, and he had been quiet for a while in the way that she now knew meant he was working up to something specific. "I am going to say this once clearly," he said. "All right," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been in a state of being unable to say that clearly for approximately 4 months, and I am done with being unable to say it. I love you and I would like you to marry me, and I am asking you to do so with the full knowledge that you would be marrying a widower with 2 sons and a cattle ranch in the New Mexico territory, and a personality that my wife once accurately described as resembling a fence post." She pressed her lips together against a smile. "Is that the proposal?" "It is," he said. "I did not practice a speech." "It's a good thing you didn't," she said. "A practiced speech would not have suited you at all. Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That is a yes, unambiguously and without reservation." He kissed her again, less carefully than the first time, and she put her hands against his chest and felt the particular warmth of a man who has decided to stop managing his feelings and simply have them. And the November stars blazed overhead and the ranch was quiet. And inside the house, because she could hear them through the window, Eli said to Samuel in a clearly audible whisper, "I told you," and Samuel said, "You did not tell me I told you," and Eli said, "I told you first." And they were off again, and she and Noah both laughed against each other in the dark. They were married at the church in Sweetwater Creek on a Saturday in December of 1883, 6 weeks after the proposal, which Theresa considered perfectly adequate time to arrange a wedding that was suited to the participants, which was to say without excessive ceremony, but with genuine intention. She wore a dress that had been made by the seamstress in town from fabric she had chosen herself, a deep blue that she thought suited the territory better than white, and she carried a small bouquet of dried late flowers from the garden she had planted in the spring. Eli was profoundly grave and serious about the occasion, having decided that as the eldest son he bore a ceremonial responsibility that required him to be dignified and adult. He was largely successful at this until the moment the minister asked Noah to repeat the vows, and Noah said them in that quiet, certain voice with his eyes on Teresa's face. And Eli, standing beside his father, blinked very rapidly several times in a manner that he would later, if asked, attribute entirely to dust. Samuel cried openly and without embarrassment, and when Theresa looked at him he said, through his tears with complete matter-of-fact honesty, "I am very happy," and she thought her heart would break from the beauty of it. Hector and the hands were there, and most of the town, because Sweetwater Creek was not so large that a wedding was not of general interest, and the reception afterward in the church hall was warm and loud, and full of things that the Fairchild household had been missing for a long time, which was people eating together with enjoyment and noise and no silence at all. They danced, which she had not expected from him, but it turned out that Noah Fairchild danced with the same quiet, certain precision with which he did everything physical, and dancing with him was like riding a good horse, easy and powerful, and she thought as they moved around the church hall floor that she could not have imagined, in April when she had climbed down from the Santa Fe stage in her patched traveling dress, that December would look like this. Winter on the ranch was its own thing, close and internal, the days shorter and quieter, the family drawn into the house by the cold. She learned new things about him. He read more than she had expected, history primarily, and he was a better cook than he admitted, which came out when she was unwell for 3 days in January, and he ran the kitchen himself with a competence that the boys found mildly miraculous. He had opinions about books and expressed them directly and was genuinely interested in hers. He had a temper that was slow to ignite and explosive when it arrived, but passed quickly and without residue, which she found she could live with. He was endlessly patient with his sons in ways he was apparently not always patient with adults, and watching him teach Eli to rope a post in the yard, hour after patient hour, she understood something about him that made her love for him add a specific layer that she thought would last her lifetime. She was pregnant by February. She told him on a Sunday morning in their room, with the winter light coming pale through the curtains, and his face went through several things rapidly before settling on an expression she had never seen before, which was a complete, unguarded, enormous happiness. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am sure," she said. He pulled her close and held her for a long time without saying anything else, and she felt him breathing steadily and carefully in the way that meant he was managing something large, and she was not going to push him to speak because sometimes managing something large in the presence of someone you loved completely was sufficient. When he did speak, what he said was, "Eli is going to be an extraordinary older brother." She laughed against his shoulder. "Samuel is going to teach the baby every piece of embarrassing information he possesses on day one." "Absolutely," he agreed. They told the boys at supper that evening. Eli absorbed it with his characteristic serious deliberateness, and then said, with considerable feeling, "Finally, which Theresa found so unexpected and so entirely Eli that she laughed until she had tears on her face, and Noah looked at his eldest son with a mixture of bafflement and profound affection, and Samuel bounced on the bench seat and wanted to know if they could name the baby after a rock. "We are not naming the baby after a rock," Noah said. "A nice rock," Samuel clarified as though this changed things. "No," Noah said. Samuel negotiated a compromise in which the baby could have a normal name, but he would also be allowed to give it a rock name of his choosing for personal use, which Theresa accepted because she had learned that Samuel's negotiations were best resolved quickly and on terms that satisfied his creativity. The spring of 1884 arrived and the garden went in again, larger this time, because she had learned from the first year what the south wall and east bed would support, and she had ideas for the north section that she thought were sound. Eli helped her plan it on paper with the map-making seriousness he brought to everything, and Samuel contributed a proposal for a separate section dedicated entirely to things that were interesting to look at, which she accommodated. Noah came out on a Saturday morning and dug the new north section himself without being asked, which she noticed and did not comment on because he knew she noticed, and they had arrived at the point in their relationship where not every acknowledged thing required being spoken. She had spent the previous spring digging this garden as an act of professional creativity, a tutor using a garden as an educational project. She spent this spring in the garden as the woman who lived here, who belonged to this land and this family, and the difference in how that felt was so large she could not have said it in words, only that when she knelt in the red dirt and put seeds into the earth with her hands, she felt the specific permanence of a thing that was going to last. Noah walked behind her one morning while she was working and bent down and kissed the back of her neck, which was not a gesture she would have predicted from him, but which she found so exactly right that she sat back on her heels and looked at him with an expression that made him smile in the way that had become her favorite of all the things she had changed in him, wide and unguarded and entirely present. "What was that for?" she asked. "I was walking past," he said. It seemed correct. She threw a small clod of garden dirt at him, which he caught and set down carefully and looked at her in a way that promised, with complete seriousness, consequences. They were extraordinarily happy. She was aware of it not as a fact she had to remind herself of, but as something present in her body, the way the pregnancy was, a weight and warmth that was simply there, constant. The baby was born in August, the 16th, on a hot afternoon with the summer thunderheads building in the west, delivered by the doctor who rode out from town at speed when Noah sent one of the hands for him, and it was a boy. A healthy, substantial, loud boy who arrived with opinions and no hesitation about expressing them, and who Noah held for the first time with an expression of such complete, helpless love that Theresa, who was exhausted and sore and entirely overwhelmed, watched her husband holding their son, and thought that she had walked off a stagecoach in a patched dress 14 months ago and somehow arrived here, in this room, in this life. They named him Thomas, after her father, which had been Noah's suggestion. Thomas James Fairchild, known in the household primarily as Tom, and known to Samuel, who kept his word with considerable creative commitment, as Garnet. "You are not calling this baby Garnet," Noah told Samuel. "Only in private," Samuel said. "Only between me and the baby." "The baby," Noah said, "is 6 days old and cannot have an opinion on this." "I am representing his interests," Samuel said, with a dignity that was entirely his own. Tom Fairchild grew and thrived in the way that children do when they are surrounded by people who love them unconditionally and a great deal. He was a solid, cheerful child who had Theresa's directness and Noah's tendency toward deliberate action, and some entirely original quality that she thought must have been assembled specifically for him by the territory itself. He was walking by the following spring and had strong opinions about the garden and the chickens, and which of the ranch dogs were his particular associates. Eli, who had been 9 when she arrived and was 11 when Tom was born, was exactly the extraordinary older brother Noah had predicted. He carried Tom with a careful seriousness, read to him before he had any idea what was being said, taught him the names of rocks with a patience that exceeded even Noah's, and was so fundamentally decent about the whole enterprise of having a baby brother that Theresa sometimes looked at him and thought he was a more complete human being than most adults she had known. Samuel was chaotic and loving and inventive, and Tom adored him without reservation, which was entirely appropriate because Samuel was the person who made Tom laugh the hardest, which was, as far as Tom was concerned, the most important qualification for love. The years settled into a pattern that was full rather than still. The ranch continued to grow, slowly and steadily, the way things grow when they are built correctly. Noah expanded the herd in 1885 and brought on 2 additional hands, and Theresa took on the bookkeeping, which had been done imperfectly by the previous system, and was now done with the precision of a person who understood numbers and organization and had strong feelings about both. Their accounts were in the best shape they had ever been, and Noah told her so with the directness she appreciated, adding that he had been a fool not to have a proper accounting system years ago, and she agreed with him, which made him laugh. She was pregnant again in the autumn of 1885. This one arrived in June of 1886, another boy, which Samuel considered entirely reasonable because boys were better at being interesting, and which Noah greeted with the same enormous, helpless love he had brought to the first one. They named him William after Noah's father, and he was called Will, and he was from his first weeks on this earth a different proposition from Tom, quieter and more watchful, with a quality of interior attention that made him seem older than he was. "He watches everything," Noah said one evening, looking at Will in the wooden cradle by the fire. "He gets that from you," Theresa said. Noah considered this. "I didn't think I did it at 3 months." "You absolutely did," she said. He smiled at that, and she thought that the face she loved had in 3 years become so familiar and dear that she could read every variation of it, could tell the difference between his listening silence and his thinking silence and his sad silence and his happy silence, and the specific silence he used when he was looking at her when he thought she wasn't noticing. She noticed. She always noticed. Eli turned 13 in 1886 and began working real shifts alongside the ranch hands, which was appropriate for a boy his age in the territory, and he brought to the work the same methodical seriousness that he brought to everything. And Hector told Noah in July that the boy was going to be the best foreman in the territory in 10 years, and Noah told Theresa this with the pride of a man trying not to show how much he felt, which was his way still, though the wall was down and the seal broken and had been for years. Samuel turned 11 and continued to be himself, which was to say inventive and loud and deeply loving and occasionally exasperating, in ways that were so creative in their exasperation that it was difficult to be properly annoyed. He had discovered drawing and was filling notebooks with illustrations of rocks and lizards, and the ranch dogs and portraits of the family that were recognizable and full of specific detail, and showed a genuine gift that Theresa began, quietly and with care, to encourage. The schoolhouse in Sweetwater Creek had its 3rd teacher in 1886, this one sober and committed and genuinely skilled, and Theresa had supplemented the boys' formal schooling with their home education since the beginning. But she and the new teacher, a woman named Frances Hartley who had come from Denver, formed a friendship that Theresa found tremendously enjoyable. Because Frances was sharp and well-read, and had equally strong feelings about water rights law and the education of children in the territory. She asked Noah one evening whether he would be willing to contribute to an expansion of the schoolhouse, and he said, "Tell me the numbers." And she told him the numbers, and he looked at them and said, "Double it," and she said, "I knew I loved you for a reason," and he said with a smile, "Only one reason." And she said, "Many reasons, but the willingness to double it is a strong recent addition to the list." And he pulled her close, and the evening went on in the warm house with Tom, and Will asleep and Eli reading in the sitting room and Samuel at the kitchen table filling another notebook. The dark past that had lived in this house, the silence and the grief and the contracted, careful management of loss, was still there in the way that true things are always there, part of the structure of the place. Margaret Fairchild was not forgotten and was not meant to be. She had built this house and planted this garden and given these boys their early years and their characters and the quality of kindness that lived in both of them, and Theresa had no interest in erasing that. She had instead added to it, added her own presence and warmth and argument and love to the foundation that was already there, and the result was something that was built from more than one source and therefore sturdier than it would have been any other way. On the anniversary of Margaret's death in April of 1887, which was 5 years since she had gone, Noah went to the small grave marker on the east side of the property in the morning. Theresa watched him go from the kitchen window and did not go with him. He was there for about 20 minutes, and when he came back to the house his eyes were red at the edges, and he came directly to where she was at the stove and put his arms around her from behind and held her for a moment without speaking. "Eli left wildflowers," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw." "Samuel drew a picture of her," she said. "He found the portrait in the trunk and reproduced it from memory. It was quite remarkable." "I know," Noah said in a voice that was rough. "He gave it to me last night." She put her hands over his and they stood at the stove together in the morning quiet, and outside the territory was bright and clear, and the garden was beginning its spring, and Tom was in the yard with the older dog, and the house breathed around them with the sound of a place that was full and living and built on everything that had come before. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I am." And she believed him, because she knew the difference between the yes he used to manage things and the yes that was simply true. That summer, Tom, who was 3, fell asleep at the supper table with a biscuit in his hand and his face in his plate, which produced the most sustained and genuine family laughter Theresa had witnessed since the evening of the horned toad, and which Tom accepted upon being woken with the dignity of a person who has decided that everyone laughing is acceptable as long as he is allowed to finish his biscuit, which he was. Noah looked across the table at Eli, who was 13 and trying to look more mature than his laughter was allowing, and at Samuel, who was not trying to look anything except happily undone, and at Tom, who was eating his biscuit with great seriousness. And he looked at Theresa at the other end of the table with the lamplight making everything gold, and she saw him see it, the whole picture of the table, the fullness of it, the way the silence had been filled permanently and without any prospect of return. "What are you smiling at?" she asked. "My table," he said. She looked at him, this man she had come to in a patched dress with a set of school books and found to be the most completely surprising thing the territory had ever offered her, and she said, "It is a very good table." "The best I've ever had," he said, and she knew exactly as he meant it that he was not talking about the furniture. The years continued to build themselves out of the days, which was the only way years ever built themselves. The ranch grew, and the boys grew, and the territory around them changed with the slow, inevitable change of a frontier, in the process of becoming something settled. The railroad came through the county in 1888, 30 miles south, and changed what the cattle trade looked like. Eli, by now 15, had the instincts of a cattleman and had begun talking to Noah about what the railroad meant for how they drove the herd, conversations that Noah participated in as an equal rather than a teacher, which Eli received with the seriousness it deserved. Samuel turned 14 and his notebooks had become portfolios, drawings and watercolors and inkwork that was showing a genuine artistic vision, and Francis Hartley had arranged for him to correspond with a man in Santa Fe who taught drawing and painting and had told her frankly that the boy had a talent that should not be left unencouraged on a cattle ranch. Theresa brought this to Noah, and he read the correspondence and said, with the directness she had always loved in him, "What does he want?" He wants to go to Santa Fe for the summer to study, she said. He's 14. He can board with the Hartley family's people there. It's safe and it's real. Noah was quiet for a moment. Margaret would have gone with him personally and supervised the whole enterprise, he said. She would have, Theresa agreed. But Samuel is Samuel, and he is going to fill that city with drawings of lizards and make the teacher reconsider everything he thought he knew about subject matter. Noah smiled, and the smile reached his eyes and went past them. Yes, he said. Let him go. Samuel went to Santa Fe for 6 weeks in the summer of 1888 and came back with a portfolio that made Theresa gasp and made Eli look at it for a long time with the particular focused attention. He gave things he was genuinely moved by and say, "Finally, you're going to be something remarkable." He said it to his brother the way you say a true thing plainly, without decoration. And Samuel, who was dramatic about most things, received this with a quiet and total grace. Tom was 4 and Will was 2 in 1888, and the two of them had established a dynamic that was entirely their own and somewhat alarming to witness, because Will's quiet watchfulness combined with Tom's bold forward motion meant that they accomplished things together that neither could have managed alone, and that were, periodically, things that required adult intervention. The ranch dogs were their associates in these enterprises, which the dogs appeared to accept with more tolerance than the situation warranted. Theresa found herself, in the quiet of one evening while Noah was at his desk and the house was settled into its night sounds, thinking back to the first evening she had sat between Eli and Samuel at that table and asked what made them laugh. She had been frustrated that night, and a little desperate, and more than a little in over her head in ways she had not entirely acknowledged to herself. She had not known then what she was starting. She had not known that the sound of Eli and Samuel laughing about a horned toad was the first note of something that would build, over the following years, into the fullest thing she had ever been part of. She went into Noah's study and sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair where she had sat the night they had pored over the Marsh documentation together, and he looked up from whatever he was reviewing and said, "What?" "I'm thinking," she said. "About the first year," she said, "what this house was." He set down his pen and sat back. He looked at her with full attention, which was always how he looked at things he considered important. "And what it is now," he said. "Yes," she said. He came around the desk and pulled her up from the chair and held her the way he had taken to holding her, close and certain, and she leaned into him with the particular ease of people who have learned each other so thoroughly that being together is like the resolution of a chord, something natural and complete. "You walked in here," he said against her hair, "and you sat between my sons at supper and you asked them what made them laugh." "You remember that evening?" she asked. "I remember everything," he said. "I was sitting at the head of my table watching my boys laugh for the first time in a year, and I knew before I was ready to know it." "What did you know?" she said. "That I was not going to be able to maintain appropriate professional distance from you," he said, with the dry humor that was one of her favorite things about him. "Not even slightly." She laughed, and he laughed, and outside the territory night was enormous and full of stars. And inside the house there were 4 boys and a marriage and a garden that had been growing since 1883 and was richer every year, and a table that was never silent anymore, that rang with argument and laughter, and the specific, beautiful noise of a family that had fought its way back from grief to something that was not merely survival but genuine, complete, abundant life. The year 1889 brought New Mexico Territory closer to statehood, which was debated in Sweetwater Creek and across the territory with the passionate investment of people who understood that the rules of their world were about to be formally established. Noah had opinions, expressed in the direct, evidence-based way he had, and Theresa had opinions, expressed in the direct, evidence-based way she had, and they disagreed on several points and agreed on most, and their conversations about territorial politics at the supper table became something the boys participated in with increasing sophistication as they grew older. Hector retired from the heavy ranch work in 1889, his knee finally refusing to cooperate with what he asked of it, and Noah built him a small house on the east side of the property, and gave him a section of land, and told him he was welcome to stay as long as he liked, which he did. Theresa brought Hector his meals on the bad days, and they talked. These two people who had both loved Noah Fairchild in different ways and from different distances and watched him come back to himself over the years. And Hector told her once, on an October afternoon with the gold light coming through his window, that she was the finest thing that had happened to this family since the Fairchilds first put root in this ground. "Hector," she said, "you will make me cry." "Would that be a problem?" he asked. "I am trying to maintain dignity," she said. "With respect, Miss Cooper," he said, still calling her that after 6 years as a private joke between them, "you have never in your life needed to maintain dignity. You have always simply had it." She thought about that for a long time. The second decade of the Fairchild Ranch's life with Theresa in it was different from the first in the way that things that have settled and grown are different from things that are still in the process of becoming. Eli turned 17 in 1890 and was already the best horseman on the ranch, and had his father's eye for cattle and his mother's organizational precision, and a quality of leadership that was quiet and absolute. And when he rode out with the hands, there was no question about who they looked to. Noah told Theresa one evening, with the restraint of a man who is too moved to say it fully, that he thought his eldest son was going to be, in the truest sense, the thing this ranch had been built to produce. Samuel came back from Santa Fe in 1890 at 16, with a letter of introduction to a man in Denver who worked with the burgeoning illustrated press, and with the portfolio of his 2 summers' work. And the conversation he and Noah had about what to do with his gift was one of the best conversations Theresa had ever witnessed, not because it was without difficulty, but because it was completely honest on both sides. A father who loved his son and wanted him nearby, and understood that loving a person meant sometimes helping them go. And a son who loved his family and his land, and also contained a thing that was going to need larger rooms than Sweetwater Creek had to offer. Samuel was going to be all right, more than all right. He was going to be extraordinary in his own way, the way that the territory itself was extraordinary, enormous and particular and full of things worth seeing. Tom, who was 6 in 1890, had firmly established himself as a person of fierce affections and considerable physical courage, which combination meant that he was on the one hand the child most likely to be found attempting to climb something inadvisable, and on the other hand the child most likely to be found sitting with an injured animal in the barn, tending it with a focused gentleness that was entirely his own. Will, 4 years old, watched his brother with the quiet intensity that was his signature, and was learning things continuously, and storing them away in a manner that made Theresa think he was going to understand the world differently from anyone else she knew. She sat at the supper table in the autumn of 1890 and looked at her family. Noah at the head of it, 17 years and many days past the raw grief of 1882 and present now in every sense. The guarded man entirely replaced not by someone who had forgotten to be careful, but by someone who had decided that the things worth protecting were worth being present for. Eli across from her, nearly grown, already the man he was going to be. Tom and Will on the bench, Tom teaching Will something with the biscuit that was probably not food-related and definitely not table-appropriate. Samuel home from Santa Fe for the fall, sitting beside Eli and telling him something about Denver that was making Eli's face do its rare, surprised delight. She thought about silence, the full year of it she had walked into, the way it had sat on this family like a weight, the way a single question, asked at the right moment by a person who refused to accept that this was how it had to be, had cracked it open. She thought about how lucky she was that she had dropped that fork. She thought about how lucky she was, period, in the particular way of people who have done the work of living carefully and found that life, eventually, reflects care back at you. Noah looked up from the head of the table and caught her looking at him and said, "What is it?" Nothing, she said. Only thinking. Good thoughts. She looked around the table one more time. Tom had gotten biscuit on Will's face, and Will was regarding this with the long-suffering patience of a younger sibling who is calculating his options. Eli was gesturing about something with his fork. Samuel was laughing. Noah was watching her. The best thoughts, she said. The very best kind. He raised his coffee cup to her in a small, private toast that nobody else at the table saw. Or perhaps they saw and were too well acquainted with their parents to comment. And she raised her own cup in return. And the table went on around them, loud and full and utterly without silence. And the ranch beyond the windows was settling into its evening, and the territory sky was going orange and red and deep blue over the red rocks, and everything that had once been broken was whole. And everything that had once been silent was full of sound, and Theresa Cooper Fairchild sat at her table in her life in the middle of the wild and beautiful New Mexico territory, and was, in every complete and exact and permanent sense of the word, home.